I recently got asked a question about how to set up your coordinate system in the camera tracker in Fusion when you don't have a ground plane. So I thought I'd do this video showing you a few different techniques that may help in your own projects. So let's take a look at this clip. If we come to the beginning of the clip, you can see we have a dollying camera come into a bedroom. You never see the floor. So how can we set up this coordinate system? So there's several different approaches depending on your needs. If you'd like to follow along, I'll put a link down below. I've already done the camera track, so let me just go over that real quick if you want to get pretty similar result. Over in the camera tracker, go to track. I brought down the minimum feature separation to 0.04 and then turned on bidirectional tracking, hit auto track, let that run through. Once that was done, I went over to solve and hit solve for my initial solve. Once I got the initial solve, I came down here to maximum solve error, brought that down to 2, which selected a bunch of the bad points. Click delete to delete them and then hit solve again. And then I got an error of 0.4498. Now, if you do those same steps, you're either going to get exactly the same result or you're going to get something pretty close. But let's take a look at our actual 3D scene. So I'm going to bring our merge 3D up here and let's just take a look at the scene a little bit. Okay. You can visually see that everything is there. I can tell where the headboard is to the bed. And I can tell where the sheets and the pillows are right here. And if I look through the camera, you can see thing lines up pretty well. Okay. So let's take a look at how we can set up the coordinate system. So I'm going to let's look through the camera and I'm going to split the view just so we can see what's going on. I'm going to put the merge 3D over here just so we can see what's going on in the perspective view. So looking through the camera on the right, perspective on the left. Let's go over to export and go to unaligned in the 3D scene transform. And let's talk about this. It depends on what you need to do. Say I wanted to add some pillows to the bed. Well, easy enough. You just grab a point on top of the bed, set the origin, and then go through the same routine that you normally would do, which is grabbing some points on the bed, say like, a bunch of these, and we would set the ground plane and click aligned. And now that grid, if we look in the perspective view, you can see that all those points are aligned to the ground. And now if we add objects to the ground, like this, say I make a cube, what is it, 0.5? And I bring that cube right on top of the bed. I can just slide this around and it will line up no matter where I put it, right? Because the ground plane is perfectly aligned with the top of the bed. Right. So that's certainly one way you can do it. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other options. But say I want to add something to the wall. Now we have this set up like this, and that's fine. You can add in objects and we can throw it on the wall because we know where this is. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could set up the coordinate system based upon the walls instead of the ground that's non-existent? So let's take a look at that. Let's go back to unaligned. Under selection is, if we click on that, this drop down, we actually have a bunch of different options. We have XY plane, YZ plane. And then we have X, Y, and Z axis. Now, typically, I don't really use the X, Y, and Z axis. I feel like they do very similar things. They basically are taking all the points that you select and say they're on the X or Y or Z axis. And they work similarly to the plane options. So I just stick with the plane option. So let's take a look at, first let's look at the YZ plane. And what I want to do is I want to set the headboard to the bed. I want to set that up as the YZ plane or a wall. And how do I know where that is? So if I look, as I move around inside the perspective view, if in the bottom right here, you can see this little heads up display, and that's showing you the orientation of your view as you turn around. So I can tell, so if I'm coming from the side, Y is straight up. And if I come looking straight down, X is top to bottom, at least in this view. And then Z is left to right, like this. If I want to set up a YZ plane, that means that when I select these points on the headboard, like that, they should line up on this axis right here, basically the Z axis, the YZ plane. So let's set from selection and click aligned. And you can see it just snapped everything to this wall. And that looks awesome. We still had that origin point from the previous one, so that's why it's up high like that. And so that way, it's going to make it a lot easier. And with the points still selected, we can also try XY plane. And if we do that, you can see it should snap it right to this. So I'm going to set from selection, aligned. And there we go. If we look straight down, you can see that it's snapped right to the XY plane. And that's going to make it a lot easier to add objects. So in this case, say I want to add a picture on the wall, this is going to be a lot easier, right? Oops, not an image plane. Let's grab that. We drop that in. Now you can see that this is parallel to the camera. So that means as I move this back, all I have to do is use the axes to bring it into position, right? And it's sliding along that wall. Makes it a lot easier to place items when it's lined up like this. If it's not lined up like this, and I want to put something on the wall, it's going to be a pain because I have this is set up to the world corners. I have to bring it over like this, and now I'm going to have to rotate it. Not the end of the world. You can still do it. You know, I can rotate it around and then, you know, move it into position, and it takes a little bit more time, but you can get it there, right? That's why setting up the coordinate system is so nice. It makes it a lot easier to line things up. So I'm going to delete that. So this is looking pretty good. But there are a couple problems. First of all, if we look at the grid on the bed, if we look closely at it, that perspective isn't quite right. It's not bad, but it's not quite right. So let's go to the front view. As we look through the front view, we can see that all of these points, right, that are on the bed, all of these, that should be flat and level, okay? But it's not. You can see that it's angled. So it's not perfect. So if in the first example, we set the ground plane to the top of the bed and we were able to add an object into the scene and drop it right on the ground and move it along the ground and it would stay on top of the bed. Now it's slightly angled. And that's because we didn't pick any constraints within the camera tracker to be able to do the ground and the wall at the same time. This is some of the features that are lacking in the camera tracker is when you want to do more advanced lineups, it just doesn't have the tools for it. And that's fine. That's why we have standalone camera trackers and stuff like that that you can use if you have to get complicated. But if you only have the Fusion tracker, let's talk about some other ways that we can solve this problem. So one of the ways that I like to solve this problem, if I'm using the camera tracker in here, is that I can actually export this out and we'll set up a little system to be able to transform the camera and point cloud and scale it and all that kind of stuff and set it up. And the reason this is difficult is that in the camera tracker, say I want to turn this. Well, I can't look through the camera to see my current lineup and do any kind of operations. So it makes it very difficult. I'd have to click unaligned. I know I need to rotate it in Z, but I have no idea. I could go like 8.5 and I can click align. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. And then I can go back like this and keep on doing that, but that's definitely a pain. So let me undo that. So let's take a look at an easier way. And that is to export out our scene. So I'm going to export out our scene and let's move it up here. And I'm going to make a bunch of room here. So, okay. And let's talk about this. So we have our 3D scene. And what I want to be able to do is transform the camera and the point cloud. So after the merge 3D, let's put a transform 3D. And after that transform 3D, I want a 3D merge. So this 3D merge right here is where we're going to put everything that we don't want to transform. We're going to use it for scaling and locating objects within our scene. Everything before it is going to be transformed. So let's look through the merge 3D. I'm going to look through the camera, and then I want to look through this merge 3D over here also. And I'll put this to perspective for now so we can see what's going on. Now, when I do this, use this transform to set up our scene, I do not want the ground plane to move. If I move the transform right now, it's moving everything and it's moving the ground plane. And I don't want that. I want this ground plane to be the ground. So I'm going to move this over to here. And this is our basic setup. And so this setup right here, you'll be able to add your objects in here and line them up with the scene, and they won't be touched by the transforms. Okay. And this is going to make it a lot easier. First, let's get this leveled out, right? So I'm going to we can come to the front view again. We can try it this way. Okay. And I can go to the transform. Then I know it's Z. And I can just start to turn the camera until I get it level. And that's pretty close. And if we look in the viewer, we can see that grid lines up much better with the bed. This is what it was before. This is what it is now. So that perspective makes more sense. And so now when I drop an object on here, it's going to slide across the bed and everything is going to line up very well. So this setup is great. One drawback is when we're adding objects, it could be a little confusing. If I wanted to add an object here and I wanted to use the point cloud, remember the point cloud's over here before the transformation. So you wouldn't add it in here. So if I right click on this and say I wanted to create a shape, and this is why you see right here, it says copy point and there's actually no position point, even though I have a selected point. We would get that point if we look through the merge 3D. If I select that point, where is it? So if I select a point over here and right click, you can see I have an actual point, but not when looking through this merge 3D. You can see it doesn't have a point selected, but that's fine. It doesn't matter, but it just makes it a little bit more complicated. So if I grab this point right here, I can still create a shape, okay? But it's not adding that transform data to the point. So if I create a shape, it is creating a shape, but it's creating a shape back here at this level. I just want you to be aware of that. It's not a big deal. So when you're adding in objects using the point cloud, they're going to be put in here. You can undo this and then use the transforms, add it to that to put it into this merge 3D if you need to. But typically you can merge all the 3Ds together and it'll render out great, depending on what you need to do, okay? Just wanted to point that out. But let's get back to this. We'll say we needed to actually find the ground and we don't know where it is. This is where we can do a little bit of detective work and try to figure out where that ground is. We can either use points in here or we could bring in a 3D model. And so let's take a look at, one option is to take a look at the proportions within our scene. So I'm going to come back to perspective for a second over here. And what we could do is we could come here and we can use the grid in here, and I'll show you in a second how this works, but we can use kind of, are there any proportions in here? Like this is the top of the bed, right? So from the top of the bed to the floor, what do you think is the same proportion in the scene? Maybe from here to here. And we're not talking a straight line. We're just talking Y distance. If we come here to say, not the front, go to the right, and I zoom in here. Okay. And if it's hard to see, as I select points, right, it's hard to see because it's similar color to the errors. If we come over to the point cloud, we can come over here and say use per point colors. Let's turn that off. Then they'll all be white and it's a lot easier to see the points. When I talk about just the Y value, I mean the height of from here to here, not a straight line to it. And we can grab points in here and get kind of a distance. So if I say from here to say right here, shift select that point is about the same as from this point to the floor, then we can kind of use this to judge the distance. Because as I zoom in, you can see the grid stays the same, right? So we can kind of judge 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 to just in the Y direction from here to here. So if that is true, those proportions are true, then we can move this up 9 or 10 blocks in our grid. So we can do that by grabbing our transform and we'll just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So just over the darker one. Bring that up to about 9. Maybe it's 9.5, something like that. And that should roughly be, if our proportions, the proportions are correct, that should roughly be our ground. Let me turn off the ground plane for a second. And if you take a look at that grid, that looks pretty close. And so we have a rough idea based on the proportions within the scene, we can sort of figure out where things are, okay? But what if we need to make it a little bit more accurate? So what if we bring in an actual 3D model that's world scale? So I'm going to bring in world scaled model. This is from Synthesize. Wow, our scene is extremely small, okay? So we're going to have to scale up the scene now. So we can do that. Let's go over to the transform and I'm going to bring it up a good 20, 30, okay? And we're going to have to bring up the height. And so now we have this scale model, and this is really helpful, okay? The bed height should be somewhere over the knee. So we can just bring the height up like this and say we want it to be over the knee. And then we can start to set up our scene based on this, okay? So I don't know if I have the scale right but we're going to have to use several different clues to figure this out. So one thing I can do is let's bring this guy over to that bureau. I'm going to look through the camera 3D. Oops, not that way. Look through perspective, and I want to bring that guy over. So I'm going to bring the mesh over to be standing in front of that bureau. Okay, and this is just rough. I mean, unless you have actual measurements, it's going to be difficult. If you had the scale of these objects, you could build it out in 3D and bring them in, and it can help with the lining it up and scaling. You know, it's still tricky. It'd be better to use a standalone, but you can do it. Okay, so let's use these clues again to see if we can figure out what's going on. So I'm going to go to the right view, and let's figure this out. How do we feel about that? So this is the knob to that drawer. Where do we think that is? It's probably, I mean, how do we feel about the height of the bed? It would be up to this is the top of the mattress is right here. Maybe it should be a little bit lower or higher. I don't know. But you'll have to judge that. And then we can work with two different things. We're going to work with the scale. So it does seem a little small. And then translate up. And so this is really what you do. You sit here and you would kind of play with these until the proportions look correct. And we can use the clues within the scene. So the distance between this point and that point, if we come to the, I guess we can just go to perspective. If I look around this way, let me move this guy around. We want him right in between there. And we can use those points. Do we think this is as wide as the person? It's probably about the same width, and that looks pretty close. The height of the bed, are we happy with that? Let me see from the right view. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's right there. Bed heights can be a little bit different, but roughly maybe it's a little bit lower. So maybe we can scale it down, something like that. Yeah. And then the height of and we can check this because we can go bring him over here. Does that look correct? Yeah. I mean, that looks about, maybe that's a little too much. We can just play with these scales until we're happy. Yeah, and I think that looks pretty good. So we'd use the clues within inside your scene, get it pretty close. This looks pretty good. It may not be super exact, but this scene right here is a lot easier to work with, I would say, right? It's very clear where everything is. We could bring out that ground plane to be a lot bigger so you can really see it, right? And that makes a lot of sense, right? Your scene looks it's very clear. I can see where the bed is. The mattress height looks about right. Proportions seem pretty close. You know, you can play with it a little bit more to make sure that everything lines up the way you need it to. Just by using clues without even any measurements, you can absolutely set up your scene pretty accurately. Not bad. So I think that's about it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.